we are pleased and proud to be Region 2 Network members and to participate in events like this one today. So our next session is Spanish for library staff, bringing language access to your library. And our presenter today is Carolyn Smith. Carolyn is the Facilities and Access Consultant at the South Carolina State Library, where she supports the state's 42 public library systems. Prior to her current role, she worked for the Charleston County Public Library for 9 years. Carolyn received her MLIS from the University of South Carolina in 2011 and has been a member of Reforma since 2015. She currently serves as treasurer for the newly formed Reforma de las Carolinas chapter, which represents North and South Carolina. Carolyn was recognized by Library Journal as a mover and shaker in 2020 and is a certified professional in accessibility core competencies. I'm really pleased to turn the microphone over to Carolyn and have her share with us from her expertise. There will be time for questions and we'll be monitoring the chat after Carolyn's presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. We'll go ahead to the next slide. And this is my agenda for today. Very brief introduction to language justice and barriers, but I want to spend most of the time focusing on our state library's basic Spanish for library staff program and how that program can be used by other libraries. And then we'll have a Spanish mini lesson as an example so you can see what we do in a typical program. And hopefully we'll have time to talk about language learning as a strategy for language access and how that fits into the bigger picture. Next slide, please. So my main objective today is giving you all access to our resources for helping library staff learn basic Spanish communication skills. And then again, placing that strategy into the larger context of more equitable library service for Spanish speakers. Next slide. We can skip over my introduction, but it's in the slides if you want to review it later. So language justice, I assume that you all are here today because you already believe and recognize the importance of being able to communicate in your own language. And that ties into the idea of language justice. And although libraries aspire to be for everyone, in reality, we know that many barriers can get in the way. Next slide. These are some examples of barriers that our patrons may face, especially if they speak a different language. They may have limited access to different library programs, services, collections, and information. And on top of that, they may also have cultural barriers, past experiences, or a lack of past experiences with public libraries or any library. Library policies, fines and fees, and other practical needs like transportation and childcare can all stand in the way to being able to use library services. Next slide, please. So I'll share what we did at the South Carolina State Library with our basic Spanish for library staff program, and again, share all the materials that you can use and adapt for your own libraries. Next slide. So a little history about our program. It starts in 2014 with my own story of learning Spanish and basic Spanish in a library setting. I worked at the Charleston County Public Library, and we had a very large, quickly growing Latino population. Some of our schools were a majority Latino, with a lot of children that had parents who did not speak English. And this population was very underserved and just under-resourced because it was so quickly growing. So in my role, this was my first position as a reference librarian at the front desk, and it was a daily experience to have someone walk in and ask if anyone was available who could help them in Spanish. And I would have to tell them no, and then do the best I could with Google Translate or, you know, English and other tools that I had. And that really motivated me because I kind of wanted to learn Spanish anyway, to start practicing and see what I could learn. Now, over the years, I moved to pretty conversational and was able to use Spanish very practically in the library. But that was only one part of the work that I started doing. I also worked at forming partnerships and bringing other people in from the community to lead programs. And we hosted a variety of programs that were in Spanish, bilingual, and just tried to generally provide better access in Spanish to our services. And we did see through that our demographics changed. We started to see many more Spanish speakers and Latino families using the library. And I do think me learning Spanish at that conversational level was really helpful in facilitating that and building some stronger relationships. So fast forward to 2017, I moved to a new position at the South Carolina State Library as their inclusive services consultant. And through that position, I support the state's 42 county public library systems. And I get to visit the libraries, talk to the staff, see what their needs are. And I saw that many other libraries in our state had similar situations with very large underserved populations, not many resources in Spanish, and very few Spanish-speaking library staff. So one of the first programs that I started was an informal virtual practice group, and I repeated that series every year, added to it and improved it until it's at its current stage. So we'll go to the next slide and talk about that series. So the goals of this series are to equip staff with basic Spanish vocabulary and library-related scripts, to increase staff confidence to engage with Spanish speakers, to raise awareness of barriers of access, and to build cultural competency. And also important to mention are some of the limitations that the series has and some things that are not the goals. I do not try to teach grammar or general Spanish vocabulary. We keep it pretty specific to library related terms. And the series does not get anyone from 0 to fluent. It is not nearly that involved. It is not a formal class, and I am not a language teacher. I lead the series from the perspective of someone who has learned basic Spanish and used it in a library setting. And my preference, which I've done for the past couple of years, is to co-host the series with a native speaker who can bring more depth of knowledge to the program. Next slide, please. So here is the overview of what the program looks like. I have a 6-week series. Each session is 1 hour. I'm able to offer that once or twice a year, and we offer it by Zoom. There are pros and cons to this, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. But the series is my target audience is any library staff in the state of South Carolina. And so really we have to use Zoom so that people don't have to travel to attend, so they can join remotely. And we decided to record it because I'm only able to offer it once or twice a year. And many people aren't able to work it into their schedules, and they like to be able to at least access the recordings. A downside of that is I also encourage people to practice, and it's interactive, and not everyone wants to be recorded while they're practicing their language skills. So we do only share those recordings with the participants. They're not public on YouTube for anyone to see. My series does have a broad reach. I have typically over 100 registrants, and there is generally a waiting list. and not all of those participate live. So the live group is usually between 25 up to about 50. And again, there are pros and cons to this. I would strongly recommend a smaller group for most people because that will allow more participation. Our group has just gotten very large because there is such a demand and such a need for this, and lots of library staff, just like I was, that are getting those requests every day and trying their best to help. My series does include all levels. We have a lot of very basic beginners and some intermediate people participating. And I try to co-host the series with native speakers. The new Reforma de las Carolinas chapter has been a great partnership for this. And we've co-hosted the series with librarians, library staff who work in libraries in South Carolina and are also from 4 different countries. And they rotate out so that our participants get to encounter different accents and different perspectives. Go to the next slide. So these are our weekly themes. The first theme talks about customer service and communication, and the communication phrases are a little more general, but they're phrases that I found really helpful from a basic learner perspective. Like one of my favorites is, ¿Puede repetirlo más despacio, por favor? Or can you repeat that slower, please? So there's an emphasis on really practical, basic vocabulary and a lot of discussion about how to use this in a real world setting. Then we talk about different areas of library service, and there's a link and a QR code on this slide. Thank you for pasting that in the chat as well. This goes to our LibGuide with all of the vocabulary lists that you can download. You can customize them. Our slides are available too, and they are licensed for reuse. So please take them, host your own series, make improvements, and let me know what you come up with. We'll go to the next slide. So these are some of the activities that we do in a typical session. We have introductions where we use the raise hand feature in Zoom and let everyone who wants to introduce themselves and share something about themselves in Spanish for some practice speaking. We do a vocabulary review on that theme. We do some reading practice of a children's book that is Spanish or bilingual, and that has been one of my favorite activities. We do listening practice where we listen to a short video in Spanish, often something like a library tour in Spanish, and then talk about it for practice. We have discussions on different topics, touching on cultural competency. We share resources, and more recently, we've started doing some breakout groups to try to split our group up between the more basic learners and the intermediate folks. Next slide. These are some of the discussion topics. We talk about outreach and partnerships, how to advertise in Spanish or to Spanish speakers, sharing resources either related to learning the language or resources that your Spanish-speaking community may benefit from, Spanish collections, and translations and language access. And even though we share these resources and have discussions, this is not a full training on any of these topics. It just scratches the surface. But I like to include the discussions because most people who participate are doing that because they are really trying to find a way to address the larger needs of their Spanish-speaking communities, and these discussions help them to start making some connections. Next slide. So lessons learned and what's next. So I've been overwhelmed with how much interest and need there is in this series. Again, every time I offer it, we have a wait list. We have over 100 people wanting to take it, which is really more than I would like to have in a session because we do try to keep it interactive. And so we are really not able to meet the demand for the series, which is why I would love for more libraries to start offering their own series. And once someone takes the series one time, they often like to come back and review and get more practice. So it's something that some people do take over and over. So again, libraries can adapt materials to host their own groups. One point I would like to highlight also is that increasing the confidence has been a huge benefit of this series. I've had several participants that really had pretty good Spanish, but they weren't comfortable going out and using it in the real world. And the series provided a safe place for them to practice, to try it out, to get some feedback and connect with others so that they were more confident going to an outreach event and talking to people in Spanish and signing them up for library cards. And they sort of needed permission to go out and start this work. I also found concerning the pros and cons of our approach that there are a lot of individual differences in learning. I prefer a smaller group size. We still do some informal practice sessions with maybe 5 or so people that allows us to make it much more personal and really answer everyone's questions and customize it to their level. So it is challenging to have multiple levels engaged at the same time. And when we get our course evaluations, I often have one evaluation that says, you know, it's too fast, I need to slow down, I need more practice. And I have another evaluation that says, you know, the practice wastes my time and I want language immersion. So those are 2 different groups that it could be really helpful if you have the capacity to have one group for beginners and another group for more advanced learners. Again, the Zoom format has its pros and cons. It's really our only option since we have a large geographical area that we're covering, and it works for us. But if you have the opportunity, if you're doing a similar program at you know, one metropolitan area or one library system, it could be really helpful, I think, to meet in person and allow you to do more activities. And some people may be more comfortable sharing as well. And finally, look for collaborations with Reforma. Having our new local chapter was a great network for us to get more people involved in our program. And Reforma National has a translation committee that has some great resources. I'll share the link in a few minutes. And if you have a local chapter, that's a great place to start. If you don't have a local chapter, I would be happy to talk individually with anyone who is interested in starting one and share how it went for North and South Carolina. Next slide, please. So we will go on to the mini lesson. Next slide. And just to show you some of the activities we do to introduce yourself, normally we use raise hand and take turns speaking in the microphone. But if you would like to type in the chat, you could participate in that way. And we would say something like, Hola, me llamo Carolina, which is hello, I'm called Caroline. And then share some things about ourselves, like trabajo en la Biblioteca del Estado de Carolina del Sur. That's I work in the South Carolina State Library. For most people, it's a little easier if you work in a city or county library just to say the name of that city or county. So we share that. And then each week I find a different, you know, fact or detail about yourself to share, like mi color favorito es el morado, or my favorite color is purple, and use that just to learn some more vocabulary. Go to the next slide. Then we do reading practice each week, and I like to find books that are by native Spanish speakers or written bilingually or in Spanish originally, but this one is Lola en la Biblioteca, which was a translation, but it has very good basic library specific vocabulary. So it's a good one for this group. And we take turns reading out loud the pages. Generally, my co-host, who is a native Spanish speaker, will read it first to model the pronunciation. And it just gets people speaking without having to think too much of trying to find the right word, and exposes them to vocabulary and helps them work on their pronunciation. Next slide. And here is one of our short vocabulary lists related to getting a library card. There's a library card application in English in the middle, and some labels that are not always word for word translations. Sometimes we will, in a typical class, we'll talk about them and talk about different ways you may say the same thing, or what questions you might get from your patrons in the library. But just to go through these, la solicitud is one way to say an application. Nombre is name. Apellidos, middle and last name. And normally I have a native Spanish speaker will pronounce all of these words for the participants and say it a couple times to help them listen for the pronunciation. And with apellidos, we talk about having two last names and have some cultural competency conversations there. Dirección, we talk about the address and having the street number. And then for P.O. Box, we have dirección para correo si es diferente. So that's something I often would explain as your mailing address if it's different from your street address, because some people were often confused about having to put their address twice on a form if it was the same. Going down to the bottom, we also have correo electrónico, no es necesario. So that is email address, and it's not necessary to put there because that was another question. A lot of patrons we have don't have an email address, so we have to reassure them it's okay to leave that blank. And so in the program, we talk through, how do you say these different things? What questions do your patrons have? And sometimes brainstorm additional vocabulary at the same time. We'll go to the next slide. These are some phrases for getting a library card that we have on the vocabulary list. So, do you have a library card? Tiene una tarjeta de la biblioteca. Would you like to get one? Le gustaría obtenerla. And again, I typically read the English, and then I let a native speaker read the Spanish. They usually read it twice, pretty slowly, by request of our group. What do I have to do? Something a patron may ask you. ¿Qué tengo que hacer? We need an ID with your photo. Necesitamos una identificación con su foto. And here, we often then talk about what are your library's policies? What does your library accept? What types of IDs do you need to show? And go over words like una pasaporte, a passport. Sometimes we talk about a proof of address. And so it helps to have that live discussion so that we can answer those questions and think of additional vocabulary. Then please fill out this application. Por favor, llene esta solicitud. Please sign here. Por favor, firme aquí. And here is your new card. Aquí está su nueva tarjeta. So we'll go to the next slide. Sometimes we have time to play a game with the group, and we may be able to try this in the chat, but this game is Basta, and we play it. We are pretty flexible with the rules since we're just brainstorming vocabulary, but we take a Spanish letter. In this example, it's ere in Spanish or R, and you think of a word in each category that starts with that letter. So for animal, I have la rana. For thing or una cosa, a thing, reloj, and you think of something that starts in each category, beginning with that letter. And I think we have time to quickly brainstorm a couple if you would like to try it. We can use the Spanish letter B or B. And can you think of an animal that starts with that letter? If so, go ahead and type it in the chat. Burro, right? And so our participants will think through the words. We usually take a minute to think of all the categories. Any other animals? Nice. And then going over to the next column to una cosa, or a thing, an object. What begins with B? And I thought of bolígrafo as an example for a pen. So just a fun way to add some extra vocabulary. Yeah. And we don't worry about points, especially with a large group, but it's always nice, even for our intermediate learners, to learn some more words in that way as well. And I learn words whenever we do it as well. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. So is language learning for you? We'll talk a little bit about what all is involved with a library staff member building their own language skills. Next slide, please. So it can take between 600 and 750 hours to go from beginner to fluent, according to the Foreign Service Institute. And that's to reach the level of professional proficiency. This is a 6-hour series, so it's only a small amount of building fluency. And the Foreign Service Institute also estimates that it could take 24 to 30 weeks to build fluency, and that's at practicing or going to classes for 25 hours a week, which is out of the capabilities of most library staff with full-time jobs. But there are a lot of individual factors that can affect, you know, people learning at different rates. Some people just have a better natural capacity to pick things up quickly, and for some people it may be very challenging. Prior experience has a big role, and time spent learning. For myself, I did not have much prior experience to draw on, but being in a setting where I was constantly being asked for help in Spanish and could immediately apply it almost in like an immersive environment, that was very motivating for me and gave me a lot of natural opportunities to practice. So that is very helpful for people that have just a need to use it right away. We'll go to the next slide. But even though it can take hundreds of hours to become fluent, there are ways you can use some Spanish at the more beginner level while you work on improving. And so some people start the series at no proficiency or level 0, and they may only know a few words, but they're able to get up to memorized proficiency and start to use some memorized phrases, understanding isolated numbers, words, and phrases. And that can already be a little useful at a front desk situation, even in connecting someone with an interpreter or another bilingual staff member who may be available, or a community partner. And some people are able to get up to elementary proficiency where they're answering basic questions. Often that's where you want to be if you're going to travel and use a language in another country. And that could be something like signing someone up for a library card. You basically have a script that you can follow, you know the common questions people ask and can explain that process. Limited working proficiency is even more useful and having basic conversations, social situations, and being more proficient with work requirements. And then if you go to the next slide, the next level 3 is professional working proficiency, and that is where that 600-hour estimate roughly comes in, where you can communicate with ease, you can communicate at a normal speed without slowing down, still make mistakes, but still are able to understand everything. And so that's a level some staff will eventually get to if they're using it for years. But even before that point, it can be have some useful applications. We'll go to the next slide. So language access strategies, and thinking about what tools are in your toolbox and how basic Spanish may fit into that picture. Go ahead and advance to the next graphic. So a lot of libraries that I have visited and that I've worked with use this first strategy much more than we should, but at times it has been the only thing available, to have a family or friend translating for the customer, and more often than not, that's a child translating for a parent, which just has so many problems. Should not be the only strategy. It places a huge burden on that child and limits what you can communicate and who you can communicate with. So go ahead and show the rest of some other strategies that could be available. Nonverbal communication, it has its limitations, but it's still very important to making someone feel welcome and showing them how they can use the library. Prepared information in Spanish. Many libraries will produce videos or handouts and things that can be professionally translated, but available for any frontline staff member to help a patron access. Universal design and plain language are also two really useful strategies that are useful for speakers of any language and useful for other groups and anyone else as well. Universal design talks about having things in multiple formats, so that, for example, a printed text or a spoken word may be more accessible to some people, or things like having small pictures and icons on your signage, so that regardless of whether you understand the printed word, you have that nonverbal image. Plain language is also very helpful in not overcomplicating our written communication, so that it's easier to read if English is your second or third language, and just more concise and clear. Then you have your basic Spanish skills, and this can be very important for frontline staff, whether even if your library has bilingual staff as well, which many of our libraries are starting to have more bilingual staff now in the state of South Carolina, you still don't want them to be alone in serving the entire Spanish-speaking community. And it is a very helpful way of supporting them and being ready to serve whoever walks in. Working with community partners and volunteers is a great way to build those relationships and also sometimes bring in more language skills. Having bilingual and bicultural staff on board as well. Automatic translation apps, we talk about those, and using things like Google Translate, which can quickly get you something, but are not always accurate or reliable. So we talk about some of these tools in our program, and kind of the pros and cons, and when is it appropriate to use which tool. Paid translation and interpretation, I also encourage people to use and to recognize the additional skills that a professional interpreter or translator brings that take time and skill to develop that you may not have just because you're bilingual. We'll go to the next slide. And to language access policies and procedures, this could be a whole other presentation, but this is a process that we recently went through at our state library to create a policy for limited English proficiency and a language access plan looking at our internal procedures. And I do think it's very important not to leave language access to, say, an individual staff member who's passionate about it or has the skills, but to make sure it's incorporated into your organization's goals, your policies, and your procedures, and to spread that work out. So you can do that through policies and procedures by having a designated person to coordinate the efforts, by working with departments like communications and public relations, and very important to look at how you recruit bilingual staff members, staff with language skills. How is that incorporated into job descriptions and bilingual pay? So if you're interested in learning more, there's a link to a language access assessment and planning tool from LAP.gov. And that was one guiding document that was very useful for us at our state library during this process. Next slide, please. So going back to our takeaways from basic Spanish to library staff, I do believe that every staff member plays a part in serving our Spanish-speaking communities, and that no matter what language skills or backgrounds you have, we have to find a way to serve anyone who walks in the door. And with language learning, learning a language requires being in a space where you are a very beginner, don't know much. You have to make mistakes to learn, and it requires getting out of your comfort zone. So that's something that can be overwhelming for people to start doing. They're very afraid of making mistakes, and participating in the class is one way to get past that, to encourage people to start learning and start getting out there and talking to people and making those connections. And even with imperfect language skills, you can still make an impact and start to build some bridges in your community. So language learning is one part of a bigger strategy of advocacy and access. And with all of those language tools that I talked about a minute ago, and the policies and procedures, and even staffing, and who has bilingual staff to serve their communities, some libraries are farther along that process than others, and it can be overwhelming to start when your library may have nothing in place. But I would encourage libraries to start where they are, do something, take a small step now, and keep building on it, because it is a process and you don't have to get everything perfect at first, but we can continually improve and make more progress in terms of language equity. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. I have a list of resources here. The South Carolina State Library's LibGuide with all our materials is available. And the next link is for the Colorado State Library. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. And I have to shout out my colleague, Christy Moran at the Colorado State Library has also started her own Spanish for Library Staff program. And we co-presented recently at PLA about our programs. She had a little different approach. And so she is a great person to talk to hear other ways of doing this program. And she has a lot of resources available on her page as well. The New Spanish for Librarians is a document from the Reforma Translations Committee with some great vocabulary to draw on that is more extensive than the vocabulary that I use in our program. And finally, Reforma. Reforma is the National Association to promote library and information services to Latinos and the Spanish-speaking. They are a national organization that anyone can join. They also have local chapters in various regions. So if you are in North or South Carolina, definitely get in touch with me and get involved with our local Reforma de las Carolinas chapter. And next slide. And now I am open to your questions. So please let me know what your questions are. And if we want to go to the next slide, we'll show our my contact information as well. So you can always reach me at by email later on. What questions do we have?
Carolyn, thank you so much for your presentation. It's been terrific. And I know people are walking away with some great ideas and inspiration and hopefully feel empowered to try something and to contact you or Christy, who's graciously offered her help as well. We have plenty of time for questions. So if people have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We have Susan in the chat said, normally I think doing SWOT exercises, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, is a waste of time because I've only been in full office sort of situation. But I think if a library wants to figure out how they will implement services in their library and which people and online resources to use, maybe the SWOT could be useful. Did you do any SWOT analyses as you were preparing to implement this program?
Well, as a consultant, I've met with a lot of libraries in our state and just talked through, you know, where are you? What does your collection look like? Do you have connections with Spanish speakers in your community? Those types of things. And often those staff that I meet with are the ones that want to work on their own Spanish skills and will attend the program too as part of that. So yeah, I think a SWOT analysis can be useful. And it's also in South Carolina, it's interesting how different the resources available at different libraries are, where we do have libraries with wonderful bilingual employees that still are not able to be everywhere at one time and to serve everyone, and still are not enough. And then we have libraries with such a small budget, such a limited staff that, you know, Google Translate and some community partnerships is all that they have been able to do, but can still gradually work on building their capacity.
Great. So we have a visitor online from Lima, Peru, who sends her greetings. So we are reaching a wide audience today, so that's exciting. So I'm going to ask another question, Carolyn. It came up in the last session about dialects and translating, you know, kind of colloquialisms, for lack of a better word. Have you run into some challenges in that way in doing this work?
Well, when I lead the series, I lead it from the perspective of a learner and do not readily admit that my accent is not perfect. I do not know all the colloquialisms and that kind of thing. When I have a co-host there, they can add their perspective and often multiple perspectives. But when I talk about using basic Spanish, I use the website SpanishDict.com and show learners how to find what country this particular word is used in. Our population is mostly from Latin America, and we stick to the more Latin American words or the most general word when we can. And most of the vocabulary that we're learning is pretty basic as well. But I also talk about, you know, communication phrases that can help when you don't understand, like como se dice, how do you say such and such, and having some back and forth to get to understanding when you're at that basic level. And yeah, and since this is for the National Library of Medicine, we wouldn't be trying to translate for example, complex medical information. But maybe with the basic Spanish, we can help you get to a website and find, an authoritative source and, help you get to that point.
Right. Thank you. Lots of kudos going on in the chat. Lots of thank yous. Any other questions for Carolyn?
Does anyone have a basic Spanish for library staff group or anything similar where they are? Do you think there is a need for it in your area since we have people from all over?
Not seeing anything. Well, hopefully people will be inspired after your presentation. So again, Carolyn, thank you so much. I think we'll go ahead and close this session.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.